good afternoon, everyone. And I hope that you on Zoom can hear and see well. We have a very small group here in person, extremely small because the weather's not very kind to us, but we go ahead regardless. And we look forward to good conversations with David and John. I am here to say that Dick Carter is unable to be with us today because he's not well, and he sends his best and may possibly appear on screen, but we send our best wishes to Dick, and therefore I will introduce the afternoon as Dick normally would, and also acknowledge the land on which we meet here, which is the land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects as we always do, and to them. This is part of our series, number 4 in our series on living, how our Christianity affects our living. And we have 2 presenters today for the title, Living in the 21st Century, Stop Looking Back, 20 to 30 Centuries, Quite So Much, and Think About Today. And this is an emphasis on the theologian Lloyd Gearing. Our 2 speakers today are David Merritt and John Gunson, whom we welcome most warmly, and we thank them in anticipation for their addresses to us. Straight away, I will introduce our speakers. David probably needs no introduction whatsoever. He has been with us and is actually a founding member of this PCNV, a retired minister of the Uniting Church, much experience within that Australia-wide of education and publishing, long-time secretary and generator of the idea and the concept of this series. So our other speaker is the Reverend John Gunson, whom I will introduce a little more with more detail later, but I'm going to ask David right away to begin his presentation. He will take us through where we've come from in the series and now where we're going to, with special emphasis on Lloyd Gearing. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Lorna. I thought that as this is the 4th in the series of 5, and it takes a different direction to the first 3, it would be quite useful to remind ourselves of how we started and where we've come, and indeed where we're going. It began as an acceptance by the committee of PCNV that it was a good time to reconnect with some of the people who've been most influential in the Progressive Christian Network in Australia. I'm getting an echo. Is anybody else troubled by that?
Yeah, it's me.
I don't know whether Greg can advise what causes that. Might be my place. So what we were intending to do in this series of 5 is to look at the key figures and what they gave to us. In 3 previous sessions, let me find my visual for that. The idea was that in the series, we're presented with alternatives to traditional Christianity and a range of alternatives which make different assumptions. The first in the series was a question about which Christian way do you choose, based on a presentation by Marcus Borg of 2 streams of activity by Christians in the 4 centuries, 17, 18, 19, 20. The reason that 400-year period was selected was that that is the period in which there has been a remarkable transformation of knowledge in the Western world, as the period of a wave of scientific discovery. For example, in the beginning of the 17th century, Galileo saw for the first time some of the movements of planets, and using the observations of Copernicus, a Polish astronomer, he decided that the evidence was very strongly that the sun did not revolve around the Earth as the then Christian view held it, but that the Earth and other planets revolved around the sun. This was a confrontational blow to traditional Christianity of the time, and the Pope would not accept it, and Galileo was banished to reside in house arrest for the rest of his life. And looking further down the period of the 400 years, just to take another great example of the dramatic nature of the change in knowledge, was the work of Charles Darwin, and an English geologist and biologist. After 5 years voyage on that famous voyage of the Beagle, in which he could gain extra insights into the development of animals and plant life on a range of places from Australia to Ecuador, he published in 1859 an absolutely landmark book called On the Origin of Species, in which he described the process by which all living things developed, including us as self-conscious understanders of the universe. And the method was of descent from existing species of a variety of innovative forms, and that the selection of which ones would endure and become the basis of other species was by how well they featured and thrived in their natural environment. So what Borg said was that there were two ways of responding to this wave of new information, new knowledge. On the left-hand column, he outlined what happened when conservative Christians said we must not accept any of this destruction of our view of Christianity. And there was opposition to every part of that scientific discovery, so much so that early in the 20th century, a group of conservative Christians formed a cooperative venture to identify what was fundamental and beyond which nothing would be yielded to new science. And in the fundamentalist beliefs that were to be protected was the creation of God, of the universe, the birth of Jesus as miraculous from a virgin, and that he was the Son of God, the Bible as without error as originally given by God, and the salvation by faith in Jesus who died for our sins on the cross, his bodily resurrection from the dead to be with God the Father, and that he would return eventually for the final judgment and creation of a new world. Those fundamentalist points of view by some Christians remain to our day. On the right-hand column of that key outline of issues, Marcus Borg described Christians who responded positively to new knowledge where it was reasonably assured, and, for example, accepted that the descriptions in the first two chapters of Genesis, which were taken as literalist and literal by the fundamentalists, were in fact stories about reality based on the knowledge, the vocabulary, experience of people at the time they were written in the 25 to 30 centuries before us. He also outlined how scientific endeavour caused a rethinking of the nature of a written material that's transmitted from generation to generation. And he showed how to choose to be in that right-hand column of respect for contemporary knowledge as it emerged gave us a different understanding of the person of Jesus and the significance of the teachings of Jesus. That laid the foundations for the series. The second one was the question, how does the Bible influence your life? It followed on from the first one because some of the most dramatic confrontations about response to new knowledge in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century was about how to understand the Bible. We went to John Shelby Spong, who said that the biblical story of the perfect and finished creation from which we human beings have fallen into original sin is pre-Darwin mythology and post-Darwin nonsense. Another quote that I think is not from Spong, but by someone in the same group, the Bible has lost every major battle it has ever fought. The Bible was quoted to defend slavery, and the Bible lost. The Bible was quoted to keep women silent, and the Bible lost. The third in the series, if I can get my screen back on. I'd be happy if your screen could be varied, Greg, and I could go to the original, or is that a problem? We'll stay with it as it is. The third one was to go back to John Shelby Spong and to ask what is understood about what Christianity is. And Spong made a very strong statement that Christianity is not about religion, it's about living. And in that session, we looked at the implications that Spong saw in that statement, and particularly three short statements that are associated with John Shelby Spong's work. That the purpose of life and the guide to life and to living was and is to live fully, to love wastefully, by which Spong meant a generous love that does not just limit itself to people who deserve the love in some way, but includes all people. And the third statement, be all you can. And for Spong, that was the summary of what Christianity is about, not religion, but about living. Today, we come to the fourth in the series, which is by a reasonably contemporary theologian, Lloyd Geering, about which I'll tell you something in a minute. And his urging was to stop looking back so often to 20 to 3rd centuries ago. And as I was typing that up for these slides, I came across this statement from the History Channel under the heading Greatest Human Achievements. And I quote, "We have learned more about science in the last 50 years than in the whole of human history. The rate of technological advance is doubling every decade." And we'll see something of the implications of that in a few minutes when I take you to Lloyd Geering. But let me just float a question. Do you think it is likely that 50 years of incredible advances in knowledge, and particularly in empirical knowledge, science by observation, by experiment, that is well beyond simply belief, 50 years in which there's been the most dramatic period of changes in human knowledge, is in any way connected to what has happened in the last 50 years to Christian churches, where they have declined in numbers, declined in participants, and the whole relation of Christianity to science and knowledge has depreciated. Let me now focus then on Lloyd Geering, and this is going to be very difficult if you can't allow the screen grab. How can I take the screen off, Greg, if you're controlling it? Please remove the slides. Let me come to Lloyd Gearing. When we spoke about Bishop John Shelby Spong, we could pretty safely assume that many of you knew quite a lot about him.
David, you should be able to screen share. Try screen sharing. I've allowed it for you.
It's on screen share. Greg, is that approved? Yes, I've done it. Okay, let me go ahead and assume that I can be heard and seen. Perhaps Michael Reid, could you wave a hand if you can see me? Thank you very much. Lloyd Gearing was a person who had his mind in the contemporary world, and I've lost it. Here we go. He is a much admired theologian by some of us. For example, if I was destined to go on to a desert island and was told I could only take the writings of one person about Christianity, I would unhesitatingly say Lloyd Gearing. And if I had a second choice, I'd say that marvelous existentialist theologian, Paul Tillich, and I'm delighted that John's including him in his description of other writers in this group who bring us quite different choices. Lloyd Gearing is a Kiwi from Aotearoa, New Zealand, across the ditch, as we say. He's a much respected New Zealand citizen, and in fact has been rewarded the secular highest awards in New Zealand. If I was to name him correctly, I would say that he is Sir Lloyd George Gearing, ONZ, GNSZM, CBE, Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Victoria University, Wellington, and the first person to hold a religious post in a New Zealand university. He was born in 1918 and remarkably was 105 last February, so that he's an inspiration to blokes like me who trail 15 years behind him, not only about theology, but about living well and longevity. He began his professional career as a lecturer in theology at the Presbyterian Theological College in Dunedin in the south of the South Island. He lectured in Old Testament studies at the Uniting Church Theological College in Brisbane. He went back to the college in Dunedin as its principal. And at the peak of an impressive career, he was appointed to the first ever chair in religion in any New Zealand university at Victoria University in Wellington, because there was widespread recognition in New Zealand that he spoke in a language that people understood and conveyed quite a new understanding of religion to many Kiwis. So to put it mildly, he is no theological lightweight. Some of you may know that he's one of the few, he may be the only person in Australia or New Zealand to be charged with heresy recently. In 1967, he wrote a series of articles at Easter for a wide circulation New Zealand newspaper, and the furore that broke out was something to remember. He was charged with heresy by two laymen of his church, and eventually the Presbyterian Church gathered together ministers and laymen to consider the charge of heresy and disturbing the peace of the church. The consideration of the heresy charge didn't last very long. The hearers dismissed it fairly soon, and he was cleared to continue teaching. Famously, Lloyd Gearing said, "I don't think I did disturb the peace of the church. I think I disturbed its sleepiness, and that's a good thing." I've selected some quotes from a recent book, Reimagining God, where Lloyd expresses his vision and concerns. And you'll see on the slides that there are some words in red or bold black to emphasize the key content, and I've put them there, but the words on the screen are always in the words of Lloyd Gearing and without change. Gearing's request was that we should change from such a domination of our starting points from 20 to 30 centuries ago to looking around us at life in the 21st century. If you think about that, you will know how pertinent it is for people in our society. How often have you walked into a church, noticed at the front of the church a somewhat elegant lectern holding a book, and in that book there are documents from the first century that are called the New Testament, first century called the New Testament, and from the centuries 20 to 30 years ago that are called the Old Testament. And it's common in services for a reader to read a reading from that 20 centuries ago collection, and also from the 20 to 30 years ago selection, and for one of those to guide the leader of the service in an uphill battle to get back to the 21st century to help her or his listeners. Now, Gearing thought that it was time to definitely move from that. Greg, it's marked so that I can't move my screen. Please change the screen control you have. The first statement from Gearing is quite a spectacular one for us. He says, and he intends to remind us, that the modern secular world emerged out of Christendom. And it not only emerged out of Christendom, but is the natural offspring of its Christian matrix or setting. And if you think back over the 20th century and recall some of the radical changes that have taken place, you will see the Christian background to them, but the local working out in contemporary life. Please change the screen. Among the case he makes for the contemporary Western world to reflect its Christian origins is the evidence of society being more egalitarian, and this being characteristic of Western society, but not necessarily of other societies, that the human species is becoming more egalitarian. Slavery, for example, is universally condemned and for the most part has been eliminated. Racism, which less than a century ago was so widespread that it was not even seen for what it was, has come under increasing condemnation. That rings true for us in Australia, where it's a contemporary issue that's being pursued, particularly in relation to sport. we now deploy the kind of nationalism that leads to prejudice and jingoism. He continues with evidence about greater respect for human individuality and personal privacy. Both individuality and personal privacy receive more protection. He says former class divisions such as royalty, autocracy, aristocracy and commoners have been breaking down and disappearing altogether. I'm tempted to comment that that statement was made before the recent coronation service, but I think it still applies broadly to society. He points out that patriarchal structures in family, church and state, where male dominance was taken for granted, no longer exert the authority they once did. They're still there in many cases, but they have reduced in their impact. And that laws and customs show greater respect for individuality. Males and females, for example, are becoming more equal in status and opportunity. Again, that's a current issue spreading across Australia, relating to before the law and in salary entitlements. Homosexuals are increasingly free to acknowledge their personal orientation and be themselves. I can well remember a conversation I had with a young man of about 20 before the same-sex marriage vote, and he was close to tears as he said, "Why does Australia have to vote about whether I am good enough to be married?" And a couple of months later, I could talk to him and say, "Look at what happened. A vast majority of Australians have affirmed you as fully entitled to the marriage that you prefer, and same-sex marriage has become a part of Australian life." Gearing points out that whole populations reflect this concern, and that's evident in the welfare state. Again, think of the budget that has recently been produced in a Federation of Australia nationally and in our state, where in the very large sums of money raised for the community good and welfare, there is a significant proportion devoted to people who are poor, who have mental illness, who are not able to obtain work, who have mental disabilities or some form of impairment in their abilities, so that reflected in the welfare state is this greater concern. Now, in case you think he's speaking with rose-colored glasses and is a hopeless optimist, he's not saying that all these factors that he sees and asks us to see in the Western world in our day has completed the movement to a society like Jesus reflected and wanted. He said this, of course, there's still much more in the world to deplore. Social inequalities, injustice, cruelty, personal violence, wars, and waste of the earth's resources. That is why the church, along with all people of goodwill, must accept an important role in promoting the vision of a better world. And he says, however much the church has been open to criticism about that role in the past and indeed in the present, it's never wholly forgotten it. Which brings him to a statement about the purpose of the church. The true mission of the church is not to convert people to Christian belief in Jesus Christ as their saviour. The mission of the church is to keep alive the teaching of Jesus and to demonstrate by its own example how life is to be lived. The mission of the church is to be the leaven of the kingdom of God in society. Its role is to exemplify not a coterie of believers, but a fellowship of doers. Now, when I typed that in, I realized that coterie is not part of my vocabulary, so I had to look it up. A coterie is a group of people with common beliefs or values who band together and keep others out from that particular grouping. So the role of the church in contrast is to be a fellowship of doers. He applies this not only to the present population, but to concerns for the next generations that are coming. He asks, what about the coming social and ecological crises, which we're being increasingly warned about? And then if the human race is going to survive its ongoing population explosion, global warming and increasing competition for the Earth's resources, then we have to learn how to care for others. And that this is the kind of injunction which Jesus used to outline his vision of a new kind of world. And then this statement, the truth is that wherever we find examples today of unconditional love, whether they're performed by Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, or atheist, there we will find what Jesus called the reign of God. And in this state, I would certainly add to that list, or Sikh, with their marvelous capacity to have cooking vans appear at wherever there are people who are short of food and need hunger. So to conclude on what is said, you may be surprised to find that in the most authenticated sayings of Jesus, he never referred to himself at all. He never claimed to be the Messiah. He never spoke of his sufferings and death. He did not predict the end of the world. In his parables and aphorisms, an aphorism is a short statement that is memorable and has a comedy or exaggeration that makes it easy to remember, that in his parables and aphorisms, Jesus said little about God. Instead, he talked about the kingdom of God. He pointed to a new kind of human community, a new way of living together in the here and now, based on mutual love for fellow humans, irrespective of class, race, gender, and age. And I took that quote from one of Lloyd Geering's other books, partly because I thought it was an excellent summary, but I draw your attention to the title, which is another aspect of Lloyd Geering's understanding of the contemporary world and science, From the Big Bang to God. Many, certainly conservative Christians, if they had to talk about God and the Big Bang, would talk about from God to the Big Bang and see God as cause. Instead, Lloyd Geering traces the development of science and the development of organisms to more complex ones, to the one with a large brain and eventually a capacity for language, the human who, in attempting to understand the world, created the world God in its various languages to refer to aspects of the environment that they couldn't understand. Now, there are many aspects of that outline of Geering's teachings that will have implications for what we think. I've decided to choose just one and choose spirituality because I find it's a very common thing in groups I'm in for Christians, particularly older Christians, to be concerned about spirituality, the lack of the presence of ways of developing and growing spirituality. So Geering says, for many of us, the traditional forms of Christian spirituality that we were accustomed to and are ceasing to be useful today, simply because they were shaped to fit a different kind of world from the one we now find ourselves living in. Spirit, he says, now is a frozen metaphor from a now obsolete worldview. And its only possible meaning is a metaphorical or symbolic one. Conservative Christians, he said, continue to speak about the Holy Spirit, the power of the Spirit, and so on, without being wholly aware of the fact they live in the medieval world for religious purposes and return to the modern world for the mundane business of daily living. And he bases that on the older understanding of spirituality as referring to one of two kinds of reality, a physical or material one and a spiritual or non-material one, so that spirit, soul, etc., was part of a hypothesis of a non-material reality in which we participate, whereas in much of our other life, it is the physicality of being in which we participate. And that is now not reflected in the realities of the world in which we live if we look around the Western world. So there's a quick outline of living in the contemporary world as presented to us by Lloyd Geering, and urging us not to look back 20 or 30 centuries, but to look around us now at Western society, because it has emerged from Christendom and reflects much of the teachings of Jesus, though there's a lot more to go. Thank you, Lorna.
Thank you, David. Thank you. We've had a wide sweep there from David, from the beginnings of our series and the beginnings of thought to Lloyd Geering and the modern world. It's my privilege now. Oh, by the way, before I move on to John, do note any questions that you have for David, because of course there will be a question session at the end, but I'm going to hold that to the end as we usually do, but make a note of anything. And when we do come to the questions, you will have them in your mind. Now I'd very much like to introduce to you Reverend John Gunson. I'm reading now because I want to introduce him properly. John is a retired minister of the Uniting Church and a long-time member of PCNV. He has specialised in adult education. Prior to Church Union, John was Director of Christian Education in the Congregational Churches, with a mandate to develop adult education. And during his ministry, he completed postgraduate studies in both theology and Christian education in the United States. John took early retirement from ministry and took up secular employment in order to pursue emerging questions and doubts about theology and the form of the church. And his last appointment was as manager of human resource development with VicRoads, Victoria's State Road Authority. John remains passionate about the Jesus way and about a new form of the church. You can see that he is well qualified to talk to us. In today's presentation, John provides a wider background to theologians who, like Geering, express ideas that are based in the contemporary world. John, we look forward to what you have to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna, for your introduction, and welcome to me to participate in this seminar. As you can see, that as I expected, David has given such a comprehensive overview of Lloyd Geering's contribution to our thinking that I thought it might be useful if we had a look at the sort of background of other thinkers who have come along that same path. But first, I want to add my thank you to Bishop Splong and to Marcus Borg. They popularised the work of the Jesus Seminar in a form accessible to everyone, and we're all grateful for that. But I want to suggest that they are not appropriate references when we are dealing with the concept of God. Now, in question time, you might want to ask me about that, and I'd be certainly happy to respond. Spong, of course, said, and I quote, "Christianity is not about religion." And yet the modern church, including the Uniting Church and our progressive movement, I suspect, seems to want to selectively carry forward the God idea into our understanding of following Jesus today. The God idea is part of religion, a religious way of life that was questioned 3 to 4 centuries ago and has been slowly dying in our Western societies ever since. But rather, I want to add my thanks to Lloyd Gearing and a host of his predecessors who sought to help us to see the world through the eyes of the modern secular world, the world in which we live, a knowledge-based world, we could call it, in which there is no place for an ancient God idea, and indeed in which there is no evidence for God and a huge amount of evidence against the concept itself. Indeed, if we take the work of the Jesus Seminar and the After Jesus, Before Christianity seminar seriously, it's clear that Jesus and the Jesus movement were not about God, but about the kingdom of God, about love of neighbor. So how did God come to replace Jesus as the center of the Christian way and the Christian movement? It's become clear, especially from the work of the Jesus Seminar, that by about the 2nd century, intellectuals were attracted to the church, and they sought to explain the Jesus phenomenon in terms of both Greek and pagan philosophies which were current in their day. And they made the same mistake that the early Jerusalem church made in trying to pick up where Jesus left off, which was, instead of saying, what was it that Jesus taught and lived and practiced and encouraged? For them, the Jerusalem church and the early Christian leaders, the question became, who is Jesus? Who is this man? Now we need to explain him. And we began to explain him in terms of Platonic and pagan and Jewish ideas that were current at the time. And it was this that became codified at Nicaea and has imprisoned the church for the last 1500 years. Now, the progressive Christian movement to which we belong chose many years ago to feature Lloyd Gearing on its brochure. Perhaps it still does. But in our meetings and deliberations over many years, he seems to hardly have had a mention, nor has his scholarship been much, if at all, the subject of our discussion and our examination. And to me, that's both surprising and disappointing. Why is it that we seem to be afraid to confront the possibility that God does not exist as some sort of reality within or alongside the material universe? Why is it when serious theologians and others write books that question God, Christians tend to dismiss them by calling them atheists rather than wrestling with their arguments and their evidence. It really raises the critical question as to who is really at the centre of the Christian story and the Christian faith. Is it God or is it Jesus? If Jesus hadn't existed, there would have been no such thing as Christianity, much as Christianity nonetheless turned into a movement of religion and gave Jesus only second place. Jesus, God, whom Christianity has adopted, Jesus accepted as part of his primitive worldview, formed at a time in human history when everyone on the planet accepted the view that there was a supernatural world full of gods, full of spirits, both good and evil. And Jesus in his teaching referred both to God and to evil spirits because that was part of the worldview that he inherited. But as Christians, we're first and foremost followers of Jesus, of his way of life, how we should live. And to do that, we do not have to believe in his God, the Jewish God. And to reinforce that point, Jesus' teaching was not about God, but about how we should live. He called how we should live in religious terms. He called it living in God's kingdom, but he taught about the kingdom, not about God. The heart of Jesus' teaching and example was not God, but our neighbour. It may surprise us to know that Jesus indeed had no time for religion or the worship of God. So it's surprising that we do. Temple religion and its priests were in constant argument with Jesus because they saw him as a threat. Temple religion, its worship and sacrifices, was anathema to Jesus. And we know that he symbolically trashes the temple. That is not for him what it's all about. Now, some 300 to 400 years ago, with the Protestant Reformation, the European Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the age of religion and the supernatural world came to an end. But here we Christians are today, a tiny minority in Australia and the Western world, still clinging to the God idea, because the whole structure of the church for 2,000 years has put God at the centre, where instead the life and teaching and program of Jesus is where it began and what it should all be about today. And if we'd chosen that path, instead of continuing to go to church on Sundays and worship God, we might still be a viable institution, but we are not. And at our PCNV meetings we've had in the recent past, the privilege of hearing from leading sociologists of religion, like Gary Boomer and Philip Hughes. And so alongside Spong and Borg and Lloyd Gearing, I want to say thank you to Gary Boomer and Philip Hughes. They described to us their research showing that religion and the God concept are dying out in Western societies. They explained to us how over 80% of teenagers have rejected the God concept as incredible, and how they say they can live the ethical life today without God. And clearly the God idea is troubling to us progressives. The old theistic view of God we widely reject in favour of anything that seems to fit better our current scientific understanding of the universe. And so we've latched on to a panentheistic idea of God. But that is a concept that lacks any supporting arguments or evidence, and a concept that lacks credibility or support in the academic world today. So perhaps we should listen to Lloyd Geering, and perhaps we should pay attention to his many predecessors, whom we have perhaps ignored or dismissed, rather than paying them the attention they deserve. So let me take you on a short description of some of Lloyd Geering's predecessors. Now, I came across Lloyd Geering, I suppose, at least 25 years ago, and I've followed his leadership over the years since. But before Lloyd, I became acquainted with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, with Paul Tillich, with Bishop John Robinson, with the American Death of God theologians, and in particular, Paul Van Buren. I enjoyed especially the provoking of the British Anglican priest and Cambridge University philosophy of religion academic Don Cupid. And I read Bishop Holloway, the former head of the Scottish Episcopal Church, and the Bishop of Edinburgh, who, when he decided that Christianity needn't focus attention on God anymore, had to resign from the church. Bishop Spong managed to hang on to God, so retained his episcopal benefice in the United States. And David has already, of course, introduced us to Lloyd Geering. You know, one of the problems that Christian theologians have had with Dietrich Bonhoeffer is that, like a lot of Christian theologians who've left God behind, or who see God simply as a symbol for the highest and best that we know, the supreme values that we believe in and try to live, what some contemporary progressive writers and theologians call the sacred or the divine. These are words which we cling to because we want to retain in our understanding of our new knowledge world, a world for which there is no evidence beyond the material universe. But we ask ourselves, oh, what's going to happen to our value? And so instead we invent a panentheistic God who somehow seems to fit into the universe, but he doesn't really. There's no substance or no argument for that view of God. And we use words like sacred or divine because these aspects of life are so important to us. But they only confuse. And the biggest obstacle to the survival of the church in our modern secular world is the God idea. And unfortunately, as I began to say before sidetracking myself, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others like him continued to use the word God at the same time as they denied its historic meaning, and therefore allowed Christian theologians and scholars to say, oh, Bonhoeffer still talks about God. Bonhoeffer, His theological writings consist in a number of works, such as the extremely popular and challenging reflections on Christian life in his books, The Cost of Discipleship, his book, Life Together, and his Ethics. And these were written mainly during the Second World War, before his imprisonment by the Nazis in 1943, and his rethinking of theology while in a Nazi prison for 2 years before his execution in 1945. And these last thoughts or fragments of thought are preserved for us in his letters and papers from prison. And they were collected by his friend Eberhard Bethke, as Bonhoeffer wrote to him from his prison cell. Towards the end of his life, Bonhoeffer talked about before God and with God, we live without God. Now, the active part of that sentence is we live without God. The qualification is that we do it both before God and with God. And that's just a theologian's clever way of saying, well, whatever the word God means, and particularly as what we mean by God expressed itself in the life and mission of Jesus of Nazareth, that's how we live without God. Now, I could spend some time introducing you to John Robinson, to Paul Van Buren, to Don Cupid, and to others that we've mentioned. But since my book isn't selling enough copies, can I suggest this to you? It doesn't seem to be reading properly, but it used to be on the book table of the Progressive Christian Network in Victoria. And since I haven't attended in person since COVID, I don't know whether it still is, but if it isn't, we can supply. But in the appendices of that book, all those theologians that I've referred to, I summarize and critique, taking them, none of them 100%. And so if you want to read those theologians I've mentioned and you haven't yet done so, then you can become acquainted with them very readily and in much shorter compass in the appendices of that book, God, Ethics, and the Secular Society. Lorna, I'm done, and I'll be happy to answer questions or engage in dialogue later on.
Thank you so much, John. And I owe you an apology for not mentioning your book in my introduction. I was aware of there it was at the bottom and my glasses didn't do it for me. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And it's a very tantalizing thought to have the gift of your book and the summary of those theologians. Now, we need to arrange ourselves a little bit for questions. Can I just take a couple of minutes break while before we come to the questions, because we might organise a small group in here. I think it's better if we do it all together and we can hear what's on the screen, but I'll just check with our technical department because time is beating us. Just want to thank very much all who have appeared today, whether on Zoom or whether in person. Particularly, I mentioned our technical support here, and I never mentioned him by name, but Greg Crow, thank you so much for all the technical support that makes this possible. And finally, and most fervently to our speakers today, who have prepared most thoroughly and given us a widespread and very challenging look at ideas by and surrounding and preceding Lloyd Gearing. So thank you so much, David. David also for the concept of the series, which is taking us through thoughts and Christianity and the way, and the fact that it's all about living. And John, for your thoughtful and very well presented and tantalizing allusions to the other theologians and philosophers, which we will rush, I hope, to get a copy of your book and find out more about them. So to everybody, thank you so much for your attendance here today. And we look forward to another meeting in June when we further explore, it's the final one in the series, not to be missed, in which we further explore theologians asking us, what is this faith in terms of how we live today? So that's it. Goodbye and thank you.
Thanks.